The morning sun filtered through the tall courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor as Sarah Mitchell sat rigidly in the wooden chair beside her lawyer, James. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white from the tension. She hadn't slept properly in weeks, not since she'd received the official notice that her ex-husband was filing for full custody of their daughter Emma. The coffee she'd grabbed from the courthouse sat untouched beside her legal pad, growing cold and bitter, much like her circumstances. Sarah was only 32 years old, but this morning she felt ancient. The past 3 years had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time passing. Since her separation from 2 years ago, her life had become an endless cycle of survival. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when she could get the shifts. Her primary job was waitressing at Diner on 5th Street, where she'd been working for nearly a decade. The pay was modest, but the tips kept them afloat. In the evenings, after putting Emma to bed, she worked as a cleaning service for local businesses, scrubbing office floors and bathrooms until her hands were raw and her back ached so intensely she could barely walk to her car. On weekends, she took additional shifts at the diner, working the breakfast and lunch rushes, always smiling despite her exhaustion, because she knew every dollar counted. The reason for her relentless work ethic sat beside her now, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. Emma was 3 years and 7 months old. She had her father's dark eyes and Sarah's hair, though it was currently in messy pigtails because Sarah had been rushing to get them both ready this morning. The little girl wore a pink dress. Sarah's sister had bought it for her, and white patent leather shoes that Emma had protested wearing because she preferred her sneakers. Sarah had insisted because she wanted the judge to see that Emma was well cared for, well dressed, that her mother took pride in her appearance. Now, watching her daughter fidget nervously with the rabbit's ear, Sarah wondered if she'd made the right choice. Emma kept asking questions in that small, confused voice that broke Sarah's heart. "Mommy, why are we here? Is this where you work? Why is that man in the long black dress?" Sarah had tried to explain in terms a 3-year-old could understand. But how do you tell your child that a stranger in a courtroom is deciding whether you get to keep them? How do you explain custody battles and legal proceedings to someone who still believed the world was fundamentally good and safe? The truth about was complicated. On the surface, he was successful, a real estate developer who owned a sprawling office downtown and several properties across the state. He drove an expensive car, lived in a mansion in the prestigious Riverside district, and had connections throughout the city. When they'd married 8 years ago, Sarah had been dazzled by him. He was handsome, charming, ambitious. She'd been working at the diner then too, and he'd come in one day, smiled at her, and her life had seemed to transform overnight. They dated for 2 years, married, and Emma was born a year later. But the man she'd married wasn't the man she'd divorced, had become increasingly controlling and dismissive. He had no patience for Emma's childhood needs, her crying, her dependence on Sarah, her need for attention and affection. He resented the way Sarah's focus had shifted to their daughter. He made cutting remarks about her body, her career choices, her family. Eventually, Sarah had gathered the courage to leave, taking Emma with her to a small one-bedroom apartment in a less affluent part of the city. Hadn't fought her immediately. In fact, he'd seemed almost relieved to be free of his obligations. But about 18 months ago, his attitude had shifted. Perhaps his new girlfriend had influenced him, or perhaps he'd simply gotten bored and wanted to assert dominance over the one thing Sarah loved most. Whatever the reason, he'd hired expensive lawyers and filed for full custody, claiming Sarah was unfit to raise Emma. The accusations stung because they contained just enough grains of truth to be believable. Yes, Sarah worked long hours. Yes, sometimes Emma was watched by Sarah's sister while she was at her cleaning jobs. Yes, their apartment was small and in a neighborhood that wasn't pristine. Yes, Sarah sometimes returned home exhausted and frustrated, though she never let her emotions overflow onto Emma. Lawyers painted a picture of a negligent mother, too focused on survival to give her daughter the proper attention and environment a child deserved. Sarah's lawyer, James, was competent but not particularly aggressive. He was also not cheap, and Sarah's limited funds meant she couldn't afford the same caliber of legal representation as Mr. had warned her from day one. The judge in this case is Judge Harold. He has a history of ruling in favor of fathers, particularly wealthy fathers. He believes children need financial stability above all else. Your situation, single mother, modest income, working multiple jobs, it doesn't look good on paper. I'm going to do my best, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the verdict won't go in your favor. Those words had haunted Sarah for weeks. The possibility that she could lose Emma, that some judge who didn't know her, who'd never seen the way she braided her daughter's hair every morning, who'd never heard Emma's infectious laugh or witnessed the countless moments of tenderness between them, that this stranger could decide that was the better parent. It was a nightmare she couldn't wake from. This morning, as they sat in the courtroom waiting for proceedings to begin, Sarah kept stealing glances at Emma. Her daughter was drawing on a notepad with crayons, sketching what appeared to be flowers and circles. The innocent concentration on her small face made Sarah's chest tighten. Emma had asked that morning, "Mommy, when will we go home?" And Sarah had realized that to a 3-year-old, home was anywhere her mother was. She didn't care about square footage or the neighborhood or how much money was in the bank account. She just wanted her mom. Sarah whispered to Emma, "We'll be home soon, sweetheart. Just need to talk to the man in the black robe for a little bit." Emma looked up and smiled, that gap-toothed smile that Sarah had memorized long ago. "Okay, Mommy, I'll be good." "I know you will, baby. You're always good." Sarah's hands trembled as she took a deep breath. In just a few moments the judge would enter and the hearing would begin. Everything she'd worked for, sacrificed for, all the sleepless nights and double shifts and the constant worry about making ends meet, it all came down to this moment. Would the judge see a dedicated mother who'd done everything in her power to give her daughter a stable, loving home? Or would he see what lawyers painted, an irresponsible woman unfit for motherhood? Courtroom doors were about to open. Sarah squeezed Emma's small hand one more time, drew in a shaky breath, and prepared to fight for her daughter with every ounce of strength she possessed. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Emma jump in her seat. Judge Harold was an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with penetrating blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He was in his late 60s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades dispensing judgment from his elevated bench. His black robe seemed to add 10 additional years to his already stern appearance, and his expression suggested he'd already made up his mind before anyone had spoken a word. "We are here today regarding the custody petition filed by James versus Sarah Mitchell," Judge announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "This court will hear arguments regarding the fitness of the current custodial parent to maintain guardianship of the minor child, Emma Rose. Let the record show that both parties are present." Sarah's mouth felt dry as cotton. She'd been to court before for the preliminary hearings, but this felt different. This was the real thing. This was the day that would determine her future. She glanced at Emma, who was now drawing more earnestly on her notepad, trying to maintain her composure in this intimidating space. Sarah reached over and gently squeezed her daughter's hand. Emma looked up at her mother with those innocent, trusting eyes, and Sarah felt her resolve strengthen. She had to fight for this child. She had to. The legal team presented their case first. There were 3 of them, 2 men in expensive suits who looked like they'd never worked a day outside an air-conditioned office, and a woman with sharp features and sharper eyes who seemed to have made a career of attacking mothers. Her name was Winters, and she was lead attorney. She stood before the judge with the confidence of someone who'd won many battles in this courtroom. "Your Honor," began, her voice smooth and authoritative, "the evidence will demonstrate that while Ms. Mitchell may have good intentions, she is simply not equipped to provide the stable, structured environment that a child requires for optimal development. We will show that the respondent's financial instability, her demanding work schedule, and her inability to maintain a consistent household directly impact the minor child's welfare and psychological. Sarah felt her stomach twist. Those words sounded so clinical, so damning when spoken aloud by someone whose job was to make mothers sound like villains. The first witness was Doctor, a child psychologist hired by STEAM. She was an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and she spoke with the authority of someone who believed absolutely in her own expertise. She for nearly an hour, discussing research about child development, the importance of financial stability, and the need for consistent parental presence. Her testimony was peppered with statistics and academic references that made everything sound scientific and irrefutable. A child needs a primary residence that is stable, Doctor stated authoritatively. The child needs to know that their parent can provide adequate food, shelter, health care, and educational opportunities. When a parent is working multiple jobs, the child often experiences separation anxiety, inconsistent discipline, and inadequate supervision. The research is clear on this point. James attempted to cross-examine, but he seemed outmatched. He asked if Doctor had ever actually met Emma, to which she admitted she had not. He asked if she had visited Sarah's apartment, and again the answer was no. Yet despite having no personal knowledge of Sarah's actual parenting or living situation, Doctor maintained her position that Sarah's circumstances were inherently harmful to the child. The next witness was a social worker named Thomas Bradley, employed by the court system. He'd visited Sarah's apartment twice, brief visits, no more than 30 minutes each. He presented his findings in a monotone voice that somehow made their small but clean apartment sound like a hovel. The residence is located in a neighborhood with a higher crime rate than the city average, Bradley reported, consulting his notes. The apartment itself is approximately 650 square feet, with only one bedroom. The child sleeps in the bedroom. The mother sleeps on a sofa bed in the living room. While the unit is clean and well-maintained, the spatial limitations are concerning. The neighborhood lacks the quality schools and recreational facilities available in more affluent areas. Sarah wanted to shout, "I made sure that apartment was spotless. Emma has toys and books and everything she needs. The neighborhood is not perfect, but we're safe and I'm present." But she was warned not to disrupt the proceedings, so she sat there, seething silently, as a stranger misrepresented her life. Then came the neighbor. Saturni called a woman named who lived in the apartment building, that she'd seen Emma being picked up by a woman, Sarah's sister, several times a week. She claimed she'd heard Sarah working late at night, supposedly cleaning offices, and suggested that Emma was being left alone. "I'm not saying the mother is intentionally negligent," said carefully, clearly coached by the attorneys. "But I have concerns. There were times when I'd see the little girl looking out the window at night, waiting for her mother. It seemed sad." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Yes, there were nights when Sarah had to work when her sister watched Emma. But Emma had never been alone. She'd been cared for by family, and if Emma looked out the window, it was because she was a curious child, not because she was neglected or abandoned. The most damaging testimony came from himself. He wore an expensive suit and presented himself with perfect composure. He spoke about his successful business, his stable home in Riverside, the excellent schools in that district, and his desire to provide Emma with every advantage in life. "I love my daughter," said, his voice breaking slightly, clearly a rehearsed performance. "I simply believe she deserves the best possible circumstances. Sarah is a hard worker, I don't deny that, but I can provide more. I can offer stability, resources, and a home where Emma can thrive. She'll have her own room, the best education, opportunities that Sarah simply cannot afford to give her." What didn't mention was that he'd never wanted to spend time with Emma when they were together. He didn't mention the times he'd complained about her crying or the times he'd made Sarah feel guilty for wanting to be a present mother. He didn't mention that his love was conditional on image and status. By lunchtime, Sarah felt as though she'd been beaten down by a relentless force. Her lawyer whispered to her, They're building a strong narrative. We need to counter it effectively this afternoon. But how could she counter the narrative that money was everything? How could she compete with expert testimony from paid professionals who'd never met her daughter? How could she argue that love and presence mattered more than square footage and neighborhood status when the judge kept nodding along with every point the other side made? When they reconvened after lunch, Sarah noticed Judge's expression hadn't changed. He looked exactly as unmoved and predisposed against her as he had at the beginning of the day. As her lawyer began presenting their defense, Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that the morning's testimony might have already decided the case. Judge seemed to have made up his mind. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mommy, when are we leaving? I don't like it here." Sarah wished she had an answer. She wished she could tell her daughter that everything would be fine, that they'd go home and everything would return to normal. But as the afternoon proceedings continued, Sarah's hope began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of despair and helplessness. The afternoon session had resumed at 2 o'clock. Sarah's lawyer, James, had begun presenting the defense, calling to the stand Sarah's sister, who about how she helped care for Emma and how dedicated Sarah was as a mother. Spoke eloquently about Sarah's sacrifice, her love for her daughter, and the bond they shared. It was good testimony, emotional and genuine, but it felt like throwing pebbles at an avalanche. The judge's expression remained unchanged throughout, his pen continuing to make notes that Sarah was certain spelled doom for her case. The courtroom was stuffy and warm. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, creating a haze of dust particles that floated through the stale air. Sarah had barely eaten lunch. Her stomach was twisted into knots so tight she thought she might be sick. Emma sat beside her, swinging her feet slightly, her small body pressed against her mother's leg. The little girl was growing tired and restless. She'd been in this intimidating room for hours, and she kept asking in whispered tones when they could go home. Just as James was preparing to call another witness to testify on Sarah's behalf, the atmosphere in the courtroom suddenly changed. It started with a faint sound, a commotion from somewhere deeper in the courthouse building. Then voices raised in alarm. The sound grew louder, more urgent. "What's going on?" Judge asked irritably, looking toward the courthouse bailiff. "We're in the middle of proceedings." The bailiff shook his head, confused. "I'm not sure, Your Honor, something in the hallway." Before he could finish his sentence, the heavy courtroom doors burst open with such force they slammed against the walls. A police officer stumbled through, his uniform disheveled, his face flushed with urgency. His radio crackled with frantic voices, creating a cacophony of overlapping words and warnings. "Courthouse is under emergency evacuation," the officer shouted, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a siren. "Dangerous animal loose on the premises. German Shepherd, police-trained attack dog, escaped from evidence room during routine exercise. The animal is loose somewhere on this floor. Everyone must evacuate immediately." For a moment there was complete silence in the courtroom. Then pandemonium erupted. "What?" Judge slammed his gavel, his voice booming. "What are you talking about?" "A dog." Another officer appeared in the doorway, speaking rapidly into his radio. "Large German Shepherd, approximately 90 pounds, black and tan coloring, highly trained, potentially dangerous. Last seen near the evidence storage area on the 3rd floor. We've got teams searching all floors. All personnel are to evacuate to the parking lot or designated assembly areas." The courtroom descended into chaos. People who moments before had been sitting sedately in straight-back chairs suddenly jumped to their feet as if electrocuted. The gallery spectators, mostly lawyers waiting for their own cases, rushed toward the doors in a surge of humanity. One older woman cried out, "A dog! What dog? Where?" Judge, showing surprising agility for his age, stood up and joined the rush toward the exit. "Everyone move calmly," he commanded, though his own movements suggested anything but calm. "Exit through the main doors and proceed to the parking lot." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Her hands instinctively went to Emma, pulling her daughter close. A dangerous dog, loose in the courthouse. Here, now, of all the terrible timing. She'd heard news stories about police dogs. They were trained to attack, to subdue suspects, to be instruments of controlled aggression. A loose one could be lethal. "Come on, honey," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the absolute terror coursing through her veins. She scooped Emma up into her arms, the little girl suddenly weighing twice as much due to Sarah's trembling muscles. Emma's small arms wrapped around her mother's neck. "Mommy, what's happening?" Emma asked, her voice small and confused in the suddenly terrifying environment. "We're just going to go outside for a little bit, sweetheart. The courthouse needs to evacuate, that's all." Sarah didn't mention the dangerous dog. She didn't mention that there was a trained attack animal somewhere in this building that could seriously hurt or kill someone. What good would it do to terrify a 3-year-old? James appeared at Sarah's side. "Come on, let's go. Let's get out of here with everyone else." They joined the stream of people pushing toward the courtroom doors. The hallway beyond was packed with bodies, lawyers, court staff, other people from various hearings, all moving toward the exits with varying degrees of panic. Some were calm, evacuating methodically. Others were practically running, creating a near-stampede mentality. "Single file," an officer shouted at the crowd. "Everyone stay calm and exit in an orderly fashion." But there was nothing orderly about it. People were being separated from their companions. A woman in a business suit dropped her briefcase and didn't stop to pick it up. A man was shouting for someone named David. The sounds of panic echoed through the marble corridors, bouncing off the walls and multiplying, making everything seem more chaotic than it actually was. Sarah held Emma, maneuvering carefully through the throng of bodies. Her lawyer had gotten separated from them, swept along by the crowd in a different direction. Sarah was alone with her daughter, trying to navigate through the chaos toward the exits. They were moving down a hallway toward what Sarah hoped was an exit when she made a critical decision. She'd heard that in dangerous situations, the safest place could sometimes be away from crowds, especially crowds moving in a panicked state. She spotted a turnoff, a side corridor that led toward the courthouse library. Fewer people had gone that direction. It seemed quieter. Sarah ducked down the side hallway, carrying Emma, moving away from the worst of the crowd. The sounds of panicked voices became more distant. She could breathe here. Emma was clinging to her, frightened but still trusting that her mother would keep her safe. They made it to the library entrance. The hallway beyond was nearly empty, quieter. Sarah took a moment to catch her breath, her heart still pounding like a wild animal in her chest. "Okay, baby, we're okay. We're just going to take this way out," she whispered to Emma, trying to soothe her daughter as much as herself. She turned the corner, moving down the library hallway. Just a few more turns and they'd be at an exit. Just a few more. That's when she saw it. The hallway ahead was completely blocked. Standing directly in their path, no more than 30 feet away, was a massive German Shepherd. The dog's black and tan coat rippled over powerful muscles. His ears were alert, pointing forward. His intelligent amber eyes fixed directly on Sarah and Emma. Sarah's entire body froze. The dog's massive chest heaved with heavy breathing. His loose leash trailed behind him like a discarded snake. Every inch of the animal's posture screamed danger. Here was a predator, finely trained, muscular, and powerful, directly blocking their only escape route. An elderly couple who had been behind them suddenly appeared in the hallway behind the dog, saw it, screamed, and bolted backward, nearly knocking Sarah over in their panic to escape. Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't run. She couldn't do anything but stand there, frozen, holding her precious daughter in her arms while facing what seemed like certain danger. "Mommy," Emma whispered, feeling her mother's sudden terror. "What's that?" Sarah couldn't answer. She was too busy trying to figure out how to protect her child from an animal that looked like it could kill them both without breaking a sweat. Time seemed to stop in that moment. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her lungs suddenly unable to function properly. Her entire body went rigid, muscles locking up as if frozen by liquid nitrogen. Every primal instinct in her brain screamed danger, red alert, threat detected, protect the child at all costs. The dog was enormous up close. Sarah had seen German shepherds before, of course, but never one quite like this. Every muscle beneath the animal's sleek coat was defined, rippling with athletic power. The dog's chest was broad and deep, built for speed and strength. His legs were long and perfectly proportioned, designed by evolution and training to be lethal weapons. The animal's paws were large enough to knock down a grown man with a single impact. But it was the dog's eyes that truly terrified Sarah. They were intelligent eyes, amber-colored, alert, focused. These weren't the eyes of a simple house pet. These were the eyes of a creature that had been trained to assess threats, to react with split-second precision, to do harm when commanded. Sarah had heard stories about police dogs. She'd seen news footage. Dogs like this had bitten through protective gear. Dogs like this had taken down armed suspects. Dogs like this could inflict catastrophic injuries. The animal's posture was rigid, aggressive. His ears were pointed forward, tracking every micro-movement Sarah made. His body was slightly angled, as if ready to launch forward at any second. His tail was held high and stiff, not wagging, not friendly, just alert and ready. A slight growl vibrated in his chest, a low rumble that Sarah could almost feel reverberating through the marble floor beneath her feet. Sarah's mind raced through scenarios, each one more horrifying than the last. If she tried to run, the dog would catch them. A 3-year-old couldn't run fast, and carrying Emma while running would be almost impossible. The dog would catch them within seconds. If she screamed, it might trigger the animal's attack instinct. If she made sudden movements, that could provoke an aggressive response. If she turned her back, predatory instinct would kick in. She was trapped. Her arms tightened around Emma, pulling her daughter closer. Emma, sensing her mother's terror, began to tremble slightly. The little girl's small arms squeezed around Sarah's neck, and she buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "Mommy," Emma whispered, her voice small and frightened. "That's a big doggy." Sarah wanted to respond, but her throat felt closed off. Every muscle in her body was tense to the point of pain. She couldn't take her eyes off the dog. The animal's gaze was fixed directly on her, those intelligent eyes tracking her, assessing her, judging her as a threat or prey or competitor. The dog took a step forward. Sarah's breath caught. Her heart, which had been pounding, seemed to stutter and skip. She instinctively took a step backward, her legs moving almost of their own volition. The library door was behind her, maybe 30 feet away. If she could just reach it, maybe she could slam it shut, creating a barrier between her daughter and this predator. The dog took another step forward and another. It was stalking her. That was what Sarah realized with crystalline clarity. The animal wasn't rushing to attack. It was stalking, the way a wolf would stalk prey, the way a hunter would approach a target. Each step was calculated, deliberate, purposeful. Sarah continued backing away, her eyes never leaving the dog's. She'd read somewhere that you weren't supposed to turn your back on an aggressive dog, that direct eye contact was important, that showing fear could trigger an attack. So she kept her eyes locked on the animals, even as every fiber of her being wanted to turn and run. "Stay back," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay back, boy." The dog's ears twitched slightly at the sound of her voice, but it didn't stop advancing. The animal seemed completely focused on Sarah and Emma, as if they were the only things that existed in the world. Sarah's back foot hit something, a water fountain mounted on the hallway wall. She was running out of retreat space. The dog was now only about 20 feet away, still advancing slowly, methodically. Sarah could see the muscles in the animal's legs coiling, see the way its body was positioned, ready to launch. Emma lifted her head slightly from her mother's shoulder. The little girl could feel the fear radiating from her mother, and even at 3 years old, she seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. But instead of screaming or crying, Emma went very still, very quiet. The dog took another step, and then another. It was less than 15 feet away now. Sarah could hear the animal's breathing, could see the tension in its body. She could see the slight curl of its lip, revealing the tip of a canine tooth. This was it. This was the moment. The dog was about to attack. Sarah braced herself, making a split-second decision. If the dog lunged at her, she would turn her body to shield Emma, taking the brunt of the attack with her own body. She would fight with every ounce of strength she possessed. She would not let this animal hurt her daughter. She would rather die. The dog crouched slightly, its hind legs bending. Sarah could see the animal gathering itself, the muscles coiling like compressed springs. The attack was coming. It was imminent. "No," Sarah cried out, pulling Emma as close as possible. "No, stay away from us." But then something extraordinary happened. Emma lifted her head higher, pulling herself up in her mother's arms to look directly at the dog. The little girl's small face was calm, not terrified like Sarah's, not aggressive like the dog's, just calm and focused. Emma stared directly into the dog's amber eyes, and for a moment the animal's entire body language changed. The dog's ears twitched. The aggressive curl of its lip seemed to soften. The tension in its muscles seemed to ease just slightly. For a brief instant, the dog's aggressive posture wavered. Then the animal took another step forward, but something was different now. The stalking predator seemed less like a predator and more like something else. Something was happening, but Sarah couldn't understand what. Emma took a breath and spoke. Her small voice cut through the tense silence of the hallway with perfect clarity and surprising confidence. Only 2 words, but they were spoken with such calm authority that they seemed to change the entire dynamic of the moment. "Come here," Emma said softly. The dog's entire body seemed to respond to those 2 simple words. The animal's posture shifted. Its aggressive tension seemed to drain away like water from a broken vessel. Its ears relaxed. Its tail began to move. Sarah couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The dog, this massive, dangerous, trained attack animal, was responding to a 3-year-old girl's voice as if she'd been training it her entire life. Something impossible was happening. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. Time moved in slow motion, each second stretching out like taffy. Sarah's mind struggled to process what was happening. The dog's entire demeanor had shifted in an instant, as if a switch had been flipped somewhere deep in its canine brain. The transformation was so complete, so dramatic, that for a moment Sarah wondered if she was hallucinating from sheer terror. Emma repeated the command, her small voice steady and confident. "Come here." There was no uncertainty in those 2 words. No fear. No hesitation. The little girl spoke with an authority that seemed completely at odds with her 3 years and 7 months of life. She spoke as if she'd done this 1,000 times before, as if commanding massive police dogs was simply a normal part of her day. The German Shepherd's entire body language transformed. His aggressive stance melted away like ice cream on a summer sidewalk. His ears, which had been pointed forward in that aggressive alert posture, relaxed and dropped slightly. His tail, which had been held high and stiff, began to move, not frantically, but slowly, gently, almost tentatively, as if the dog was unsure about expressing joy but was trying it anyway. The animal took another step forward, but now it was different. The stalking predator had become something else entirely. The dog moved with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a massive creature. Each paw step was careful, measured, almost reverent. Sarah's breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Her eyes had gone wide, her pupils dilated so far they were almost entirely black. Her mind was struggling to make sense of what she was witnessing. This didn't make sense. This violated every law of nature, every principle of animal behavior, every logic-based expectation she had about dangerous animals. The dog closed the remaining distance between himself and Emma. Sarah instinctively tried to step back further, but there was nowhere to go. Her back was already against the wall. The dog was coming directly toward them, and all Sarah could do was hold Emma and brace herself for impact. But impact never came. Instead, the massive German shepherd lowered his entire body. Not aggressively, not in a crouch meant to propel into an attack, but gently, reverently, almost worshipfully. The dog sat down directly in front of Emma, his massive frame now level with the little girl's small face. The animal's head lowered further, and its eyes, those fierce, amber eyes that had seemed so threatening just moments before, softened into something almost gentle, almost loving. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped Emma, but she maintained her grip, her arms locked around her daughter with an intensity born of absolute terror, slowly transforming into absolute bewilderment. The dog pressed its massive head against Emma's small leg, in a gesture that was unmistakably one of submission, of affection, of something approaching worship. The animal's tail was now wagging slowly, gently, creating a soft swooshing sound as it moved back and forth against the marble floor. "Mommy," Emma said, her small voice cutting through the silence of the hallway. "He's sad, he needs help." Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat was closed off completely. Her brain was trying to process this sequence of events and failing spectacularly. This was impossible. This was absolutely, completely impossible. Police-trained attack dogs didn't just become gentle because a 3-year-old told them to. That wasn't how animal behavior worked. That wasn't how anything worked. But it was happening anyway. Emma reached out her small hand, her movements slow and careful despite her young age. She gently stroked the dog's head, her tiny fingers running through the coarse black and tan fur. The dog responded by pressing its head more firmly against her leg, like a cat seeking affection from its owner. "It's okay," Emma whispered to the dog, continuing to stroke its head. "You're okay now." Suddenly, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the hallway. Voices shouted urgently, "King, King, where's King? We've got the hallway sealed off, he's got to be in this sector." Officers came around the corner, at least 4 of them, all moving rapidly, all carrying poles with nets attached, all prepared for a dangerous animal. When they saw Sarah, Emma, and the massive German shepherd in that bizarre tableau, they literally skidded to a stop, their feet sliding on the polished marble floor. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The officers stared at the scene before them as if they'd stepped through a portal into an alternate reality. One of the officers, an older man with gray at his temples and a captain's insignia on his uniform, slowly stepped forward. His name tag read Foster. His eyes were wide with shock, but he moved deliberately and carefully, trying to understand what he was seeing. "King," Foster called out softly, his voice filled with confusion and wonder. "King, what are you doing? Come here, boy." But King didn't move. The dog didn't acknowledge the officer at all. The animal remained completely focused on Emma, his head resting against the little girl's leg, his tail continuing its slow, gentle wag. "How did you?" Foster started to speak to Sarah, but she was too stunned to respond. She just shook her head, still not entirely convinced she wasn't hallucinating. Foster's eyes shifted to Emma. The captain knelt down slowly, carefully, trying to appear non-threatening. "Hi there, sweetheart," he said gently. "What's your name?" "Emma," the little girl replied simply, never taking her attention off the dog. She continued to stroke his head with her small hand. "Emma," Foster repeated, his voice carrying a note of awe. "That's a beautiful name. Can you tell me what happened? How did you get King to calm down?" Emma looked up at the officer with her innocent blue eyes. "He was scared," she said simply. "He needed help. I told him to come here and he came." Foster's expression was one of complete disbelief mixed with something approaching reverence. He looked at the other officers, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "I've been working with King for 3 years," Foster said slowly, addressing the other officers but keeping his eyes on Emma. 3 years. This dog has bitten 2 suspects. He's been flagged as potentially dangerous multiple times. I've never, in all my time with him, I've never seen him respond to anyone outside his immediate handlers like this. Another officer stepped forward, this one younger, maybe in his early 30s. "Captain, what do we do? Should we take the dog into custody?" Foster held up a hand, never taking his eyes off Emma. "Nobody moves. Nobody does anything. Let me understand what's happening here first." He looked at Sarah. "Are you hurt? Is your daughter hurt?" Sarah shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, we're fine. I don't understand what just happened." "Neither do I," Foster admitted. "But whatever it is, I've never seen anything like it." More officers were gathering now, drawn by radio communications about King's location. Word was spreading through the courthouse that the dangerous dog had been located, and the news was creating a gathering. A small crowd began to form at the end of the hallway, keeping a respectful distance but watching in amazement as a 3-year-old girl with her hand on a massive German shepherd's head somehow kept the animal completely calm and docile. Emma looked around at all the faces staring at her, but she seemed unfazed by the attention. She simply continued to comfort the dog, whispering softly to it, assuring it that everything was going to be okay. Officer Foster slowly pulled out his phone. "This needs to be documented," he said quietly. "This is. I don't even know what this is, but it needs to be documented." As he began recording video, Sarah realized that this moment, this impossible, inexplicable moment, was about to become something much larger than anyone in this hallway could have anticipated. Captain Foster stood motionless, his phone still recording the extraordinary scene before him. His 20 years of law enforcement experience, all his training, all his expertise with police dogs, none of it had prepared him for this moment. His hands were trembling slightly as he watched a 3-year-old girl continue to stroke the head of a 100-pound German shepherd that had previously been considered dangerous and unpredictable. "Unbelievable," one of the younger officers muttered. "This is absolutely unbelievable." "Don't move," Foster said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Nobody approach the girl or the dog. Let's just observe and document. This is something special happening here." Sarah was still holding Emma, though she'd relaxed her grip slightly now that the immediate threat had passed. Her entire body continued to shake, adrenaline still coursing through her veins, her mind still struggling to comprehend what had occurred. She watched as Captain Foster slowly approached them, his movements careful and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Emma's small face. "You did something remarkable back there," Foster said, his voice gentle and filled with genuine wonder. "I need to understand how you did that. Can you help me?" Emma looked up at the officer, her innocent blue eyes clear and trusting. "He was scared," she said simply, as if this explained everything. "He needed someone to help him feel better." Foster knelt down to Emma's level, his weathered face showing signs of the intense emotion he was experiencing. "How did you know that? How did you know what King needed?" Emma tilted her head slightly, considering the question with a seriousness that seemed far beyond her years. "I could feel it," she said. "Like when Mommy is sad and I hug her and she feels better. He was sad too, really sad, so I talked to him nice." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of a different quality. Hearing her daughter explain something so profound, with such simplicity, was overwhelming. Emma had somehow accessed something deeper than language, deeper than training, something that transcended the normal rules of animal behavior. Foster stood up and turned to Sarah, his expression one of profound respect mixed with lingering shock. "How long has she been able to do this?" he asked. "Do what?" Sarah replied, her voice still shaky. I don't know. She's never been around dogs before. I don't know if she can do this. I don't know what just happened." "She just calmed a dangerous police dog with her presence and 2 words," Foster said, his voice carrying an intensity that made the gravity of the situation clear. "That's not something that happens naturally. That's not something I've ever witnessed in my entire career." He pulled out a small notebook from his pocket and began scribbling notes with a pen, his movements automatic, the muscle memory of years of report writing kicking in. "I need to get all the details," he muttered. "Name, age, any training history, everything." Sarah provided the information mechanically. Emma's full name was Emma Rose. She was 3 years and 7 months old. She had no formal training with animals. She'd grown up in an apartment and had rarely interacted with dogs. As far as Sarah knew, there was nothing in Emma's background that would explain her extraordinary ability. Foster's face grew more amazed with each piece of information. "This is incredible," he said. "Do you understand what your daughter just did? King is a fully trained police K-9. He's completed hundreds of hours of training. He's been certified for patrol work, detection work, and suspect apprehension. And a 3-year-old girl with no training calmed him down completely just by being present and speaking 2 simple words." Sarah felt her legs going weak. She realized she was leaning heavily against the wall, using it for support. Everything that had seemed so important just minutes ago, the custody hearing, the judge's bias, the devastating testimony, suddenly felt distant and unreal compared to what was happening now. "I need to know more about her," Foster continued, his tone shifting from shock to professional curiosity. "Has she shown any other unusual abilities, any unusual connection with animals?" "No," Sarah said. "I mean, she's a normal 3-year-old. She likes to help people. She's very empathetic even at her age. Her teachers say she's emotionally mature for her age, but I thought that was just normal development." Foster shook his head slowly. "This isn't normal development. What I witnessed here is extraordinary. The way King responded to her, it was like he recognized something in her. Like he understood she wasn't a threat, and more than that, like he understood she could help him." Emma tugged gently on King's ear, and the massive dog's tail wagged faster. The dog rolled slightly, pressing his massive body against Emma's small legs, seeking comfort from the tiny human who had somehow understood his fear. "She said he was scared," Foster said quietly, almost to himself. "How did she know that? How did she read that from a dog?" "She said she could feel it," Sarah repeated, still processing the information herself. "She said it was like when I'm sad and she hugs me." Foster's eyes widened even further. Emotional empathy manifested toward animals. At 3 years old, he pulled out his phone again, this time not to record but to make a call. "This needs to be reported," he said. "This is beyond what I can handle alone." He spoke into the phone in official terms, reporting the situation to courthouse security and the police department. Within minutes, more officers arrived, higher-ranking ones, supervisors, people who began asking questions and taking statements. Word continued to spread through the courthouse. Despite the ongoing evacuation procedures, people kept appearing at the end of the hallway, wanting to witness the incredible scene for themselves. A 3-year-old girl calming a dangerous police dog, a child with an unexplainable gift. The story was already becoming legend. Foster returned to Sarah after completing his phone calls. His expression was solemn and respectful. "I've filed a formal report about what happened here," he said. "Your daughter demonstrated extraordinary abilities today. I'm also going to recommend a psychological evaluation, not because anything is wrong with her, but because we need to understand what she is and what she can do. This kind of gift, it's rare, very rare." Sarah nodded, still struggling to process everything. "Will you need to take her somewhere?" she asked, a note of panic entering her voice. "Will I have to?" "No," Foster said firmly. "She stays with you. You're her mother. But I do need to document everything that happened here, and I may need to contact you again for follow-up questions." He looked back at Emma, who was now gently massaging King's ears, and the massive dog was responding by resting his head on the little girl's leg, completely content, completely calm, completely transformed. "I've never seen anything like this," Foster said quietly. "In 20 years on the force, I've never seen anything like this. Your daughter has a gift, Mrs. Mitchell, an extraordinary, inexplicable gift." Sarah pulled Emma close, watching as her daughter continued to comfort the massive dog with a tenderness and understanding that explanation. She didn't know what any of this meant yet. She didn't understand how it would affect their lives or the custody hearing. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that something had fundamentally changed in that hallway. Something impossible had become undeniably real. Judge Harold stood in his chambers, reading Captain Foster's official report with growing astonishment. The document was detailed and professional, written in the formal language of law enforcement, but even through that official tone, could sense the writer's profound shock and wonder at what had occurred. The report described how a 3-year-old child had single-handedly calmed a dangerous police dog, how the animal had responded to her presence with complete submission and affection, and how this contradicted everything known about the dog's previous behavior and training. Had been a judge for 37 years. He'd seen incredible things, shocking things, deeply troubling things, but he'd rarely, if ever, encountered something quite so inexplicable and remarkable. He set the report down on his mahogany desk and leaned back in his leather chair, processing the information. A knock came at his chamber door. "Your Honor," his clerk poked her head in. "The parties are ready to resume proceedings. The evacuation has been cleared and the courthouse is secure." Nodded slowly. "Before we resume, I want to speak with the child in chambers, privately. Bring Emma and her mother." His eyebrows rose slightly. This was highly unusual. Judges rarely spoke directly with young children in custody cases, and never in private, but had worked for Judge long enough to know not to question his decisions without cause. "Yes, Your Honor, I'll bring them immediately." A few minutes later, Sarah entered the chambers with Emma in her arms. The little girl looked around at the imposing room, the high ceilings, the wood paneling, the enormous desk, the legal books lining the walls, with wide eyes. Sarah appeared nervous, clearly wondering what this unexpected private meeting meant. "Please sit," said, gesturing to the chairs positioned in front of his desk. His tone was gentler than his courtroom demeanor, more human, less judicial. Sarah sat carefully, settling Emma on her lap. The little girl squirmed slightly, uncomfortable in this formal environment. Removed his glasses and looked directly at Emma. "Hello, Emma. My name is Judge. I've heard something very interesting about you today." Emma tilted her head, studying the older man with her clear blue eyes. "Hello, Judge," she said politely. "I understand you have a very special way with animals," continued. "Can you tell me about that?" Emma considered the question seriously, her small forehead furrowing slightly with concentration. "The dog was scared," she said simply. "He needed help, so I helped him." "How did you know he was scared?" asked. "I could feel it," Emma replied. "Like when Mommy is sad, I can feel when people are sad or scared, and then I help them feel better." Leaned forward slightly, his penetrating gaze fixed on the child. "Has anyone ever taught you to do that, to feel what others feel?" "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "I just do it, it's easy." Sarah watched this exchange, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what Judge was looking for, what he was thinking, what this private meeting meant for their custody case. Was he making some kind of judgment about Emma's mental state? Was this being used against her? Stood up from his desk and came around to where Emma and Sarah were sitting. He knelt down to Emma's level, his aged knees creaking slightly with the effort. "Emma, I want to ask you something very important. Do you love your mommy?" Emma's answer was immediate and absolute. "Yes, I love Mommy so much." "Why?" asked. "Because she takes care of me," Emma said, "and because she's always there when I'm scared, and because she gives me hugs even when she's very tired. She loves me very much." felt something shift inside his chest. He'd spent decades listening to people lie, manipulate, and misrepresent themselves in his courtroom. But there was no deception in this child's words. There was only simple, profound truth. "How do you feel when your mommy is sad?" asked. "I feel sad too," Emma said. "And then I try to make her feel better, like I did with the dog. When someone you love is sad, you want to help them." Stood up slowly, his knees protesting. He walked back to his desk and sat down, his expression thoughtful and distant. He looked at Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly. Is your daughter happy? When you're with her, when you're caring for her, despite your financial constraints and your work schedule, is your daughter happy?" Sarah felt her eyes welling with tears. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, Your Honor, my daughter is happy. She's loved. She's safe. She knows that her mother loves her more than anything in the world." Nodded slowly. He pulled out the file containing Emma's developmental assessments and psychological evaluations. He'd read them before, but now he read them with new understanding. Emma's emotional intelligence scores were remarkably high. Her capacity for empathy was noted as exceptional for her age. Her psychological stability and sense of security were all rated as excellent. The reports mentioned that such emotional maturity typically resulted from consistent, loving parenting and a secure home environment. "Mrs. Mitchell," said carefully, "I've been reading reports about your daughter, reports from professionals. They indicate that Emma possesses emotional intelligence far exceeding what would be expected for her age. They indicate psychological stability, emotional security, and a capacity for empathy that is quite extraordinary. Do you know what creates those qualities in a child?" Sarah shook her head. "Love," said simply. "Consistent, devoted love. A child develops that kind of emotional security when they have a parent who is present, even when that parent is working hard, even when circumstances are difficult. A child develops that kind of empathy when they see their parent displaying empathy, when they feel safe enough to develop their emotional capacities." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She didn't understand where this was going, but hearing someone speak about her relationship with Emma in such affirming terms was overwhelming. Looked back at Emma. "Thank you for talking with me," he said. "You're a very special little girl." "Thank you," Emma said politely. "Are you sad?" Blinked, surprised by the question. "What?" "You seem a little sad," Emma said, her small head tilting as she studied the judge. "You make big decisions that make other people sad sometimes. That probably makes you sad too." Felt his throat tighten. In 37 years on the bench, he'd never been asked such a question. He'd never considered whether his rulings, his judgments, his decisions affected him emotionally. He'd always prided himself on being objective, detached, impartial. But sitting across from a 3-year-old girl who could somehow perceive emotional truth beneath layers of professional distance, realized something had been missing from his judicial philosophy. "You're right," he said quietly. "Sometimes it does make me sad. Thank you for pointing that out." Appeared at the chamber door. "Your Honor, we're ready to resume proceedings whenever you're ready." Stood up. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. He looked at Sarah and Emma. "Thank you both for your time. We'll resume the hearing shortly." As Sarah gathered Emma and prepared to leave, caught her eye. His expression had completely changed. Gone was the stern, predisposed judge of the morning. In his place was someone who looked like he'd just experienced a profound awakening. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I've been listening to Captain Foster's report about what happened with the police dog, and I want you to know that I find it deeply meaningful, very meaningful indeed." Sarah didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded and left the chambers with Emma. Sat back at his desk, pulling the custody file in front of him. He began reading through all the testimony from the morning session with completely new eyes, seeing now what he'd been unable to see before, that the most important factor in a child's wasn't square footage or neighborhood status or bank account balance. It was love. Pure, consistent, devoted love. and looking at the evidence before him, it was absolutely clear where Emma's heart belonged and where she flourished. The courtroom was more crowded than it had been in the morning. News of the extraordinary incident with the police dog had spread through the courthouse like wildfire, and several people had lingered or returned specifically to witness the continuation of this custody case. Word had traveled quickly: a child with an inexplicable gift, a transformed judge, a story that seemed almost too remarkable to be true. Sarah sat rigidly in her seat, Emma beside her, both of them waiting with bated breath for Judge to deliver his ruling. Sat across the aisle with his legal team, his confidence from the morning session noticeably diminished. He'd heard about what happened with the police dog. He'd heard about the judge's private meeting with Emma, and he could see the change in the judge's demeanor. This was no longer a man predisposed to rule in his favor. Judge entered from his chambers, his expression grave and contemplative. He sat at his elevated bench and surveyed the courtroom for a long moment before speaking. When he finally began, his voice carried a weight and solemnity that was different from the morning proceedings. "I have reviewed all the testimony presented this morning," began. "I have reviewed the evidence, the reports, the evaluations, and the circumstances presented by both parties. I have also had the opportunity to speak privately with the minor child, Emma Rose, and I must say that what I have learned today has fundamentally altered my perspective on this case." He paused, his eyes moving from to Sarah, then settling on Emma. "Throughout my years on the bench, I have operated under the assumption that the most critical factors in determining child custody are financial stability, material resources, and the ability to provide for a child's physical needs. I have believed that a parent with greater wealth and resources was facto better equipped to provide for a child's." Another pause. Sarah felt her heart pounding so violently she was certain everyone in the courtroom could hear it. "However," continued, "today I have been presented with evidence that challenges that assumption. I have received testimony from a police captain regarding an extraordinary incident in which the minor child demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence, empathy, and psychological stability. These are not qualities that can be purchased with money. These are not qualities that come from material resources or prestigious neighborhoods. These are qualities that come from one source and one source alone: consistent, loving, devoted parenting." He picked up Emma's psychological evaluation and held it before him. "According to professional psychological assessments, Emma Rose demonstrates emotional intelligence and empathy scores that far exceed what would be expected for her age. Her sense of security and psychological stability are rated as excellent. Professionals note that such development typically results from a stable home environment and consistent, loving parental presence." The lawyer started to stand, as if to object, but Judge raised a hand. "I'm not finished. I have also reviewed the social worker's report," continued. "That report describes a one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood. It notes the spatial limitations and the less prestigious location. However, what that report fails to note, what I failed to adequately consider this morning, is that this modest apartment is clearly filled with love. The child who lives there is psychologically secure, emotionally intelligent, and developmentally advanced. Those facts speak volumes about the quality of parenting occurring within those walls." Sarah felt tears beginning to stream down her face. Beside her, Emma was coloring on a notepad, blissfully unaware of the magnitude of what was happening. "Furthermore," said, his voice growing stronger, "I have considered the testimony from Mrs. Torres, the mother's sister, regarding the dedicated parenting of Sarah Mitchell. I have heard testimony about a woman who works multiple jobs, who sacrifices her own comfort for her daughters, who has instilled values of compassion and empathy so profound that a 3-year-old child can somehow recognize and respond to the emotional needs of a frightened animal." He looked directly at. "I have also considered the testimony from the respondent, who spoke of providing resources and advantages. While I do not dismiss the value of such provisions, I must note that no amount of material resources can replicate what Sarah Mitchell has already provided her daughter, a foundation of love, security, and emotional intelligence that far exceeds what money can purchase. His gaze returned to Sarah. I have made my decision. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Even the ambient sounds seemed to fade away. No rustling papers, no whispered conversations, no background noise. Everyone held their breath. In the matter of versus Mitchell regarding custody of Emma Rose, announced, his voice clear and authoritative, this court awards full custody to Sarah Mitchell. The respondent's petition for custody modification is. Furthermore, I am ordering supervised visitation for the paternal parent, contingent upon compliance with specific behavioral requirements and parenting education. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause and gasps. Sarah sat in stunned silence for a moment, unable to process the words she just heard. Then she began to cry deep, wrenching sobs of relief and joy and validation and overwhelming emotion. Your Honor, continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the commotion, I want to address the court one final time on a personal level. The courtroom quieted again. This morning, I was prepared to make a ruling based on conventional wisdom and financial metrics, said. I was prepared to separate a mother from a child because of circumstances related to income and neighborhood status. But this morning, I was given an extraordinary gift. I was given the opportunity to witness something remarkable, to see a child with emotional gifts, so profound that she could calm a dangerous animal with her presence and compassion. And I was given the opportunity to recognize that this child's remarkable qualities came not from money or status, but from the love and dedication of her mother. He looked at Sarah with an expression of profound respect. Mrs. Mitchell, you have created something far more valuable than anything money can purchase. You have created a human being of remarkable emotional capacity and compassionate heart. That is the greatest achievement a parent can accomplish. My ruling today recognizes that achievement. Captain Foster, who had remained in the courtroom to hear the verdict, nodded approvingly from his position at the back of the room. 3 months later, Sarah and Emma moved into a slightly larger apartment in the same neighborhood, the same working-class area that lawyers had criticized so harshly. It wasn't in an affluent district, but it was filled with love and security, and the knowledge that they had overcome an impossible obstacle together. Captain Foster visited them one afternoon, carrying a small box. Inside was an official certificate declaring Emma an honorary Junior K-9 handler for her extraordinary service to the police department. There was also a photograph of Emma with King, the dangerous police dog, her small hand on his massive head, while the animal gazed at her with complete devotion. Emma hung the certificate on the wall of her room, directly above her bed. Can we visit King again? She asked her mother. I think Captain Foster can arrange that, Sarah said, pulling her daughter into an embrace. That evening, Sarah sat on their small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She thought about the hearing, about Judge's transformation, about the moment when everything had changed in that hallway when Emma spoke 2 simple words to a frightened animal. She thought about how her daughter's extraordinary gift had somehow seen through the systems and prejudices that often worked against single mothers, against those struggling financially, against those who didn't fit conventional definitions of success. Emma's gift had transcended all of that, touching the heart of a man who had lost his way, reminding him of what truly mattered. Sarah pulled Emma close as her daughter fell asleep beside her, and she whispered a prayer of gratitude. They had made it. Against all odds, against a system that had seemed stacked against them, they had prevailed. And in doing so, they had changed not just their own lives, but the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed Emma's extraordinary journey. The impossible had become possible. Love had triumphed, and a mother and daughter would face their future together, forever bonded by the extraordinary events that had brought them safely to this moment.